The first time I heard her name, it was whispered through a crack in a door, like smoke slipping out of a burning room. I had been in Savannah less than a week, and already the city felt like a living thing that watched me back. The river rolled in thick and black under the moon, carrying the stink of brine, mud, and something older that no sermon had ever named. In the evenings, fog rose from the marshes and slid between the houses, softening the gas lamps until every street looked like a corridor in a dream you cannot wake from. That was when the sounds began. Not the usual noises of a port city settling into night, but a low, steady murmur from the western edge of town, where the rice fields started, and the slave quarters lay like a second city hidden behind hedgerows and prayer. Some nights it was singing, some nights it was crying, and on the nights that made my skin go cold, it was silence so complete, it felt like the world was holding its breath. The old dock workers told me there was a woman out there who kept that silence when she wanted it, a woman who stood between the living and the dead, like a gate made of bone. They called her the witch, who guarded the quarters, and they said, if you went looking for her with a clean heart, you might not come back at all, and if you went looking with a dirty one, you would come back wrong. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and if you are new to Tales Never Told. Subscribe now, because this story only grows darker the deeper we step into it. In the year 1849, Savannah was a city of grace on the surface and rot underneath. The newspapers praised its squares and azalea gardens, its church spires and polite drawing rooms. But every morning before dawn, you could watch wagons creep toward the river loaded with rice barrels and cotton bales, and behind each wagon walked men and women in chains with eyes lowered, their breath making small ghosts in the damp air. The city lived on their backs, and the ones who owned those backs lived in a world of manners that required you to pretend you did not notice. I came to Savannah as a newly ordained minister sent to assist at St. Matthew Parish after Reverend Crowley fell ill. I was 24, full of scripture, and stupid enough to believe that if I spoke with enough conviction, I could mend any place God had been pushed out of. St. Matthew stood in the heart of town, whitewashed and proud, always smelling of candle wax and polished pine. But even on my first Sunday, I saw the line that split our congregation, like a blade. The white families sat forward under the stained glass and fanned themselves in silk. The enslaved people and free-colored folk sat in the back, packed tight on narrow benches near the door. They sang the same hymns, but the hymns sounded different in their mouths, lower, heavier, like they were carrying something in the notes that the front pews had never lifted. After service, I tried to greet everyone in the yard. The white parishioners were cordial, curious about the young minister from Charleston. The enslaved folk were polite, but distant, their eyes shifting past me as if they were listening for a signal from somewhere else. Only one man lingered. His name was Josiah, and he worked as a wagon driver for the Harrow family, whose estate lay west of town, near the Ogeechee Marsh. He waited until the others had moved away, then said softly, "Reverend, if you keep walking west after the last square, you will hear her." I asked, "Hear who?" He did not look at me directly. He looked at the ground. He said, "Old Mother Saba, the one who keeps the quarters safe." I laughed as gently as I could and said, "Safe from what?" Josiah lifted his head, and for a second his eyes met mine, with a kind of weary anger that made me feel small. He said, "Safe from the same thing you pray against every Sunday, Reverend, only you don't like to name it." Then he tipped his hat and left. I asked Reverend Crowley about the name after supper. He was a thin man with a cough that rattled his ribs, but his mind remained sharp. When I said Mother Saba, his spoon stopped in midair. He stared at me for a time too long to be casual, and then said, "You will hear many superstitions in this city." I said, "Is she real?" He set his spoon down slowly. He said, "There is an old woman among the Harrow slaves. She is a healer. The people trust her. The Harrows tolerate her because she keeps sickness out of their workforce. That is all you need to know. I said, why do they call her a witch? Crowley rubbed his forehead. He said, because fear needs a shape. Don't go chasing shapes, son. He coughed hard, the sound wet and deep. Then he added in a voice that had dropped to a whisper, the Harrow estate has had troubles these past years. Strange ones. I thought he would say more, but he did not. That same week, I was invited to dine at the Harrow house to bless a new nursery they had prepared. Colonel Thomas Harrow was one of the wealthiest men in Chatham County, a rice planter who made more money in a month than most people saw in a lifetime. His wife Lenora was younger, a soft woman with a smile that looked practiced, and behind that smile, I sensed exhaustion like a bruise you keep covered. Their only child, a boy named Robert, had been sickly since birth. The city spoke of it in hushed sympathy, but among the enslaved people, I heard another kind of talk. They said Robert had been born under a bad shadow. They said the Harrow blood carried a debt no doctor could bleed away. The Harrow house sat on a rise above the marsh, grand enough to make your breath catch. The driveway was lined with live oaks draped in hanging moss like old mourning veils. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and something sharp beneath it, like herbs crushed between fingers. Lenora greeted me at the door with a soft grip on my arm as if she needed anchoring. She guided me through rooms full of portraits and silver and heavy velvet curtains, then up the staircase to the nursery at the end of the second floor. It had been painted a pale yellow, with a cradle carved by a local artisan and a shelf lined with toys bright enough to hurt the eyes. Yet the room felt wrong. Not empty wrong, but waiting wrong, like a mouth held open. Colonel Harrow stood by the cradle, tall and severe, hair black with only a few strands of grey at the temples. He greeted me with blunt courtesy, then said, "Reverend, we have suffered loss in this house. 3 children before Robert, stillborn, taken by fever. God has tested us. We will not be tested again." I murmured some comfort and opened my prayer book. While I spoke the blessing, Lenora watched me with a desperation I had never seen in a woman of her class, like she was trying to catch each word in her teeth. When I finished, the colonel said, "We owe much to Providence and to good sense." He glanced toward the window overlooking the quarters. He added, "We also owe something to a certain old woman who knows how to keep the dark at bay." Lenora flinched. The colonel noticed. His jaw tightened. He said, "Don't start." Lenora put a hand to her throat and said quietly, "She frightens me." The colonel snorted. He said, "She frightens you because you do not understand what she is doing. She has saved Robert more times than any doctor in town." I asked carefully, "Are you speaking of Mother Saba?" The colonel looked me over. He said, "So you already heard the stories." I said, "I heard her name in church." He nodded once, satisfaction and warning mixed together. He said, "The slaves call her witch. The town calls her nuisance. I call her useful. She lives in a cabin near the quarters. She keeps their fevers low and their women from dying in childbirth. She knows roots and charms and old coast ways. I let her practice because I am not a fool." Lenora whispered, "She knows more than roots." The colonel rounded on her. He said, "Enough." Then to me, as if smoothing a wrinkle in his reputation, he said, "Reverend, if you hear talk of demons in the marsh, ignore it. This is a practical place. We do not need a second pulpit in the woods." I should have left then. I should have returned to town and kept my head down the way Crowley advised. But youth is a kind of blindness that feels like courage. That night after supper, as I walked down the Harrow drive toward my horse, I heard something from the far side of the estate, a low chanting that rose and fell like waves against a pier. It came from the slave quarters, faint but steady. The hair on my arms lifted. I followed the sound without thinking, boots sinking into damp earth past the last row of oak trunks. The quarters sat a half-mile away, a cluster of cabins lit by small fires, smoke curling up into a sky that held no stars. People moved between the cabins quietly, eyes flicking toward me. No one spoke. The chanting stopped when I entered the clearing, as if the air itself had snapped shut. In the sudden silence, a door opened in the farthest cabin. An old woman stepped out carrying a lantern that threw sharp light across her face. She was small, bent at the waist, wrapped in a dark shawl despite the heat. Her hair was a thick white cloud, pulled back tight, and her eyes were the color of wet river stone, pale but deep. She did not look surprised to see me. She looked like she had been expecting me for years. She raised the lantern higher, and the light caught strings of bones and beads hanging from her wrist. She said in a voice rough as bark, "Reverend." I had not told her my name. I stood rooted, my mouth dry. She took one slow step toward me. The people behind me stayed silent, watching. She said, "You come to bless a cradle, but you don't know what sleeps under it." Then she turned back toward her cabin and said something in a language I did not know. The crowd shifted like a single body. A path opened. Without looking back, she walked into the darkness of her doorway. I should have left. Instead, I followed. The inside of her cabin was darker than the night outside, not because the lamp failed, but because the shadows seemed thicker, layered like cloth hung in a closet. The air smelled of crushed leaves, smoke, and a sweetness I could not place. The walls were lined with bundles of dried herbs tied to nails, and along the rafters hung small jars filled with murky liquid that caught the lantern light and gave it back in bruised colors. A circle of ash had been drawn on the dirt floor, and inside it, arranged with careful order, were objects that should not have belonged together. A cracked porcelain doll missing its eyes, a rusted horseshoe, a small wooden cross blackened by fire, and a shallow bowl full of river water that was perfectly still, even though the cabin floor vibrated with footsteps outside. Mother Saba motioned me to a stool without looking at me. She sat on a low crate, beside a small hearth where nothing burned, yet heat rose from it like breath. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the quarters outside, the shifting bodies, the soft murmurs, the way a whole community waits for the next blow. Finally, she said, "You come from St. Matthew." I said yes. She nodded slowly. She said, "The church thinks it owns this land. The Harrow House thinks it owns these people. The marsh knows otherwise." I tried to find my voice. I said, "People call you a witch." She gave a short sound that was not quite laughter. She said, "People call the wind a thief when it takes their roof. They call the river cruel when it floods. They call me witch because they want a name that makes them feel taller." I said, "Then what are you?" She looked up at last, and I felt something in that gaze like a hand on my sternum. She said, "I am the one who remembers. I am the one who stands at the door. You have walked into a house you do not understand, Reverend. If you keep walking without learning where the floors are rotten, you will fall through." I swallowed. Said, "Colonel Harrow told me you helped their boy." She leaned back, her bones creaking under her skin like dry branches. She said, "I keep him alive, yes. Not for the colonel, not for his God, for the balance." Then she reached into a basket and pulled out a strip of cloth, stained brown, and held it between her fingers. It was a child blanket. I knew because I had seen its twin in the nursery upstairs laid over the cradle with neat corners. This strip was torn from the same weave. She said there were 3 before him, 3 who never cried long enough to learn their own names. I stared at the cloth. I felt the room tightening around us. I said, "I was told they died of sickness." Mother Saba shook her head once. She said, "They died because the Harrow line is not clean. Something was promised that should not have been promised. Something was fed that should not have been fed. When it came time to pay, the payment came out of baby lungs. I felt a chill despite the heat. I said, "Promise to who?" She dipped a finger in the bowl of river water, drew a circle on the floor just outside the ash ring, then smudged it with her thumb until the line blurred. She said, "To the thing that lives where the marsh water turns black and sweet. You know the place. Everyone knows it. No one says it loud. You call it the old sink. It is not a sink. It is a mouth. I had heard of the sink, a wide, drowned hollow in the reeds where animals disappeared and men told stories after too much whiskey." I forced a smile I did not feel. I said, "Old tales." She did not smile back. She said, "I was brought on a ship when I was a girl. I watched men thrown overboard for crying. I watched women held down and mocked so they would sell for more. You think I heard only old tales in that darkness. I heard things that were older than your stone church. I heard the names of things that do not die when you stop believing in them." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say scripture was stronger than any marsh mouth, but something in the cabin kept my tongue still. She set the cloth down beside the cross. She said, "The colonel went to St. Matthew when his first child died. He did not go for comfort. He went for permission." I frowned. I said, "Permission for what?" Her eyes narrowed like slits cut in riverstone. She said, "To make a bargain without calling it a bargain. To spill blood without calling it murder." I felt my heartbeat in my ears. I said, "Are you accusing the church?" Mother Saba looked toward the door, then back. She said, "Not all the church. Not the pews that sing because they do not know what else to do. But there are men who wear collars and love power more than mercy. Those men stood with the colonel in a room under your altar and prayed words that were not for God." I had never been under the altar except to take communion wine from the storeroom. I said, "This is impossible." She said quietly, "Is it? You have been here a few days. You already smell the rot. Don't pretend you do not." Silence. Fell so thick I heard my own breathing. Then she said, "There is a reason I guard the quarters. I do not guard them from ghosts. I guard them from the living." I asked what she meant, but she did not answer. Instead, she reached into her shawl and pulled out a small carved figure, no bigger than my palm, made of dark wood. Its head was human, its body half animal, its mouth open in a scream that had been frozen in place. She set it in the ash circle. She said, "This is a lock. It holds the door shut. Every full moon I feed it smoke and salt so it stays hungry for what I choose, not for what chooses us." I stared at it. I said, "You do this for the slaves." She nodded. She said, "I do this for the children. The marshmouth likes children. The colonel feeds it children when his fear takes him. He tells himself he is saving his family. He is only feeding his pride." I felt sick. I said, "Why would he do such a thing?" She tilted her head like she was listening to a sound beyond me. She said, "Because he is not the first hero to know the sink is a mouth. 50 years ago, the first hero cut rice fields into the marsh and watched men die of fever until he learned to pay the marsh to stay quiet. The payment was made in secret, behind shutters, with a priest holding a book open so the devil could call itself Providence." I pushed up from the stool, nauseated. I said, "If this is true, we must go to the authorities. We must stop him." Her gaze sharpened like a blade. She said, "You think the authorities do not eat from the same table. You think the sheriff will arrest the man who pays his salary. You think the bishop will shame a profitable parish. You are young enough to think light only has to be spoken to arrive. Sometimes it comes only after fire." I left her cabin, shaking, my mind half certain I had stepped into madness. Yet, when I walked back through the quarters, the people did not look at me like a stranger anymore. They looked at me like a man who had just been handed a burden and had not yet figured out how to carry it. In the days that followed, I tried to search for something solid to hold on to. I visited Reverend Crowley and asked if he knew of any meeting under the altar. His face went pale, and he told me I was overtired. He told me to focus on prayer and not on plantation gossip. But he would not meet my eyes, and when he coughed, his handkerchief came away streaked with red. I asked Josiah if he had ever seen the colonel go toward the sink. Josiah said only that the colonel sometimes rode into the marsh at night when the moon was fat and the air too still. He said sometimes the colonel came back alone, and sometimes he came back with a wagon covered in tarpaulin. He said that wagon always smelled of iron and milk. Then he stopped talking and walked away. I tried to visit the Harrow house again, to watch, to listen. Lenora welcomed me with a thin smile that quivered at the edges. Robert lay in a small bed in the sitting room, skin too pale, eyes too bright. He watched me with a seriousness that did not belong to a child. When I asked how he felt, he said, "It is loud at night." I said, "Loud where?" He pointed toward the west. He said, "In the ground." Lenora pressed a finger to her lips and whispered, "He says strange things." The colonel is at his wits. I asked about the full moon rides. Her throat bobbed. She said, "He has always been restless after dark. He says there is a sickness in the land." I used to think he meant fever. Now I am not sure. I asked if she had met Mother Saba. Lenora shuddered. She said, "I have seen her in the yard once. She did not bow. She did not look at me. She looked through me." "The colonel says she is necessary." I asked, "Necessary for what?" Lenora hesitated, then said, "For keeping the slaves obedient, for keeping the boy breathing, for keeping something else away from the house." She would not say more. That afternoon, as I walked down the hallway past the nursery, I noticed the door to a room I had not entered before. It was at the back of the second floor, near the servants' stairs, and it had a new lock on it. I asked a maid about it. She lowered her eyes and said, "That room belongs to Miss Clara." I said, "Who is Clara?" The maid glanced down the hall as if she expected the walls to report her. She said softly, "The little one, the colored child." I felt a slow cold move through me. I had not seen any child in the house, besides Robert. I asked Lenora about Clara at supper. She flinched as if I had said a forbidden name. The colonel cut in before she could speak. He said, "Clara is an orphan we took in from town. She helps Lenora with small tasks. Charity is still a virtue, even if you northerners are always looking for vice." His tone was light, but his eyes were hard. I said, "I had not heard of an orphan in your care." He said, "That is because charity is meant to be quiet. Now, Reverend, you are here for souls, not domestic matters." He changed the subject to harvest yields and political rumors. Yet when he rose from the table, he paused behind Lenora and placed a hand on her shoulder, not gently. She sat very still until he left. Later, when the house had settled, I heard soft footsteps outside my guest room. The servants' corridor was dark. A small figure stood at the end of it, half in shadow. She was maybe 10 years old, thin as a reed, skin the color of deep mahogany, hair braided tight against her scalp. She held a candle stub in one hand. Her other hand gripped the doorframe as if she expected it to move. She looked at me, eyes wide but steady. She said, "Reverend, are you the new prayer man?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can you pray quiet?" I said, "I can try." She stepped closer. The candlelight revealed bruises on her wrist, round marks like thumbprints. She noticed my look and pulled her sleeve down. She said, "They say I talk too much. I don't. I only say what I see." I asked, "Are you Clara?" She nodded. She said, "I was not orphan. I had a mama in the quarters. She died last summer." Then she added quickly, "But she not dead the way they say." I felt the hallway tilt. I said, "What do they say?" Clara lifted her chin. She said, "They say fever took her. But I saw Colonel Harrow take her in the wagon near the marsh. I saw Mother Saba cry that night, and Mother Saba don't cry. I remembered Josiah's words. Wagon smelled of iron and milk. I said softly, "Clara, why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because you wear God coat. If you are real God man, you stop him. If you are working for him, then I already dead anyway." I said, "You are not dead." She smiled sadly. She said, "I am dead to my name. They call me Clara now. They say I will grow up to help Miss Lenora, to be her shadow." I asked what she meant. Her voice dropped to a whisper that felt older than her face. She said, "Miss Lenora don't sleep. She sits in the nursery sometimes and looks like she waiting to be buried. Colonel say she sick in the head. He say when she gone, I will take her place. I will sit where she sat, hold Robert like she held him, learn how to smile for visitors, learn how to say yes. He say, I am lucky." I stared at her. The horror in those simple lines was like a door swinging open in my gut. The colonel had not taken in an orphan. He had taken a replacement, a slave child raised to become a living prosthetic for a mistress he planned to discard. I asked, "Does Lenora know this?" Clara shook her head. She said, "She knows something. She looks at me like she's sorry and scared at same time. But she don't ask. She don't got voice in this house." Before I could speak more, a floorboard creaked on the stairs. Clara stiffened. She blew out the candle with one breath and vanished into the dark like a cat slipping under a porch. I returned to my room and did not sleep. I sat by the window listening to the marsh winds and thinking of Mother Saba's words about the living being worse than ghosts. The next morning I went to the quarters under the pretense of visiting the sick. I found Mother Saba near a fire, grinding roots with a stone. I told her what Clara had said. She did not look surprised. She said, "I told you the colonel feeds the mouth. He feeds it with blood and with futures. He thinks he can sew a new wife out of a child because he has already sewn his conscience shut." I said, "We must take Clara away." Mother Saba said, "You cannot pull a seed from bad soil by shouting at it. We need to know what he plans on the next full moon." I asked how she knew there would be a plan. She pressed the pestle down slow and hard. She said, "The full moon is when the mouth opens. The colonel is weak when it calls. And this next moon is the biggest of the season. He will be hungry for a promise. He believes if he gives the mouth a woman of his house, it will spare his line." I said, "A woman of his house." Mother Saba looked at me until I understood. I said, "Lenora." She said, "Maybe Lenora. Maybe the child he is shaping for her chair. When men like him make bargains, they do not care who. The coin used to be." That night I confronted Lenora in the garden while the colonel was away in town. The azaleas were wilting in the heat, petals falling like bruised tissue onto the path. She was sitting on a stone bench, hands folded, staring at nothing. I said softly, "Lenora, I need to ask you something hard." She looked up with eyes that had no fight left. She said, "Ask," I said, "is Clara your slave?" Her mouth trembled. She said, "She is not mine. No one is mine." I said, "Does the colonel plan to replace you with her?" Her face went white. She said, "He told you that?" I said, "Clara told me she fears it." Lenora pressed her palms to her temples. She said, "He says I am failing as a wife, that I was not strong enough to carry children, that I am too soft to keep this house upright. He says he needs a woman who can do what must be done, and if God won't give him one, he will make one." I said, "Has he harmed you?" She laughed once, a brittle sound. She said, "Harmed? He has not struck me. He does not need to. Every day is a hand around my throat that never closes enough to kill me. Every night he leaves the bed and rides west. When he returns, his boots are wet with black water and he smells like the sink. He comes to me cold and says I must be grateful because he keeps evil away from our roof. I used to believe him. Now I think he is bringing evil home for supper." I said, "You must leave. There are people in town who can help." Lenora shook her head. She said, "You don't understand. There is no leaving. When I tried once, he took Robert from me and locked me in the nursery for 3 days. He told me if I ever tried again, he would send me to the sink, so I could see what my disobedience costs. I felt my mouth go dry. I said, "You believe the sink is real?" She looked toward the trees. She said, "I have heard it. I have seen him come back without the people he took. Don't ask me to pretend it is only mud." She gripped my wrist suddenly, nails biting. She whispered, "Reverend, if you believe in God, then tell me why God lets a man make a church into a door for the devil." I had no answer that would not sound like sand. I promised her I would do what I could. When I returned to St. Matthew, I went straight to the storeroom beneath the altar. I took a lantern and searched every shelf and beam. I found nothing but wine, spare hymnals, and dust. Yet when I turned to leave, I noticed scrape marks on the wooden floor near the back wall, fresh and shallow. Something heavy had been dragged there recently. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard nothing, but as I stood, the lantern flame flickered hard, though no wind touched it. I felt a cold pressure behind my ribs and a faint odor of marsh water. For a second I thought I heard a whisper. Not in my ears, but in the wood itself, a sound like wet lips making a name. I ran up the stairs and burst into the nave, heart hammering. The church was empty except for Reverend Crowley sitting alone in the front pew. His shoulders were slumped. He looked older than his years. I demanded to know what had been done under the altar. His eyes filled with tears he tried to hide. He said, "You were not meant to find this." I said, "Tell me the truth, Reverend." He coughed, then said, "When the colonel lost his first child, he came to me in the night. He begged for a ritual, not a prayer, a ritual. He said the Harrow land was cursed by the marsh and only an offering could quiet it. I told him God does not take offerings of flesh. He said he did not come to debate. He came to purchase. He brought gold and threats. He said if I refused, he would go to men who did not mind staining their hands. I refused at first. Then my own debts came due. My own cowardice opened like a wound. I asked what he had done. Crowley whispered. We held a vigil under the altar. He brought a basket covered in cloth. I did not ask what was inside. I prayed words I thought were safe. But when he opened the cloth, I saw a lamb. It was alive, it bleated. He cut its throat right there on the stone and let the blood run into a bowl. He said the marsh wants innocent breath. He said if you give it the breath of an animal, it will accept that instead of a child. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. I said, "Did it work?" Crowley shook his head. He said, "The second child died anyway." He came back furious, said the lamb was not enough, said the marsh does not want beast blood, it wants human. I said, "And what did you say?" Crowley sobbed quietly. He said, "I said no. I said never." He smiled at me like I was a boy again and said he understood. Then he left. 2 weeks later, his second child died and a free colored woman from town vanished. I knew what he had done. I went to the bishop. The bishop told me to keep my mouth shut for the sake of peace and the reputation of the church. The bishop said a man like Harrow is a pillar, and pillars do not get questioned by those who sit beneath them. I asked, "How many times?" Crowley did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Since then there have been offerings I refused to name. Have prayed while hearing wagons pass the church at night. I have smelled marsh water on the steps. I have preached about mercy while knowing my own hands are tied in this knot. I was going to confess. Then I got sick, and I thought maybe that was God making the confession for me." He looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "Please, please do not become like me." I left him there shaking. Outside, the street seemed too bright, the city too normal, as if all the evil in Savannah had learned to put on Sunday clothes. I knew then that light alone would not stop the colonel. We needed a plan, and we needed to move before the moon turned full. I returned to Mother Saba and told her what Crowley admitted. She listened without surprise. She said, The collar men were always in the bargain. That is why the colonel thinks he is righteous. He uses your prayers as a mask for his hunger. I said, "What do we do?" She said, "We shut the mouth, or we force the colonel to feed himself to it instead of another child." I recoiled. She watched me steadily. She said, "You think that is murder? Maybe it is. But what word do you use for a man who has murdered 5 children and will murder more?" The days before the full moon stretched like wire. The colonel grew restless. Lenora barely left her room. Clara moved through the servants' corridors like a shadow, silent and wary. Robert worsened, coughing at night, babbling about a voice in the ground that promised him he would never die if he listened. The slaves in the quarters whispered and watched the western tree line with eyes that knew the moon schedule better than any almanac. On the afternoon before the moon rose round, Josiah found me behind the smokehouse. He said, "Reverend, Mother Saba says be at the old sink after midnight. Come quiet. Bring no man who serves Harrow." I asked where Lenora and Clara would be. Josiah lowered his voice. He said, "The colonel told the house servants to prepare a wagon. He chained the barn doors himself. That means he is taking a woman tonight." I felt my stomach twist. When night fell, I rode out alone, leaving my horse tied near a stand of palmetto, so the hooves would not betray me. The marsh was a different world after dark. The air was thick and wet, insects whining like tiny saws. The full moon was a pale coin in the sky, making the water glint with a sheen that looked like oil on skin. I walked by memory toward the old sink, guided by the low hum of frogs and the smell of rot. Halfway there I saw figures moving ahead, low and careful. Josiah, 2 other men from the quarters, and Mother Saba at the front, her shawl a dark blot against the silver grass. She did not turn. She knew I was there. We reached the edge of the sink just as a faint lantern glow appeared on the far side. The colonel was coming. He rode a horse and led a wagon behind him. 2 slaves drove the wagon with their heads down. A third figure sat under the tarpaulin. When the wagon rolled closer, a small sob slipped out into the night, muffled but unmistakable. My fists clenched. Mother Saba placed a hand on my arm, her grip iron despite her size. She whispered, "Wait." The colonel stopped at the sink edge. He dismounted. The moonlight caught his face, and I saw sweat shining on his brow. He looked like a man dragged by a rope he could not see. He spoke to the slaves driving the wagon. They climbed down and backed away quickly, not meeting his eyes. He walked to the tarpaulin, yanked it back, and pulled out the figure beneath. It was Lenora. Her hands were bound, her hair loose, her eyes wide with terror and resignation. She tried to speak, but her mouth was gagged. The colonel cradled her face with one hand, almost tender, and said, "Don't fight, Lenora. This is for Robert. This is for us. God understands sacrifice." Then he turned toward the sink. From our hiding place behind reeds, we could see the water below, blacker than the night around it. The surface did not ripple. It waited like an open throat. The colonel began to chant. It was not Latin, not scripture, but a broken blend of prayer and something else. With each word, the air grew colder. The frogs fell silent. The hair on my neck rose. Lenora trembled so violently her knees gave. The colonel lifted her as if she weighed nothing and stepped toward the edge. That was when Mother Saba moved. She rose from the reeds and walked into the moonlight, slow and upright like a judge approaching the bench. Her voice rang across the sink. She said, "Thomas Harrow, you have fed this mouth enough. Tonight you pay your own debt." The colonel jerked around, eyes blown wide with rage and fear. He shouted, "Get back! This is not your place!" She kept walking. Behind her, Josiah and the other men stepped out holding torches that flared bright and angry. The colonel looked from them to me, emerging last, and his face twisted. He said, "Reverend, even you," I said. "This ends tonight." He laughed, high and sharp. He said, "Ends. You think you can end what the church itself began." Then he grabbed Lenora and shoved her forward toward the sink, as if to prove his power to himself. But as he did, the black water moved. Not like a wave, like something beneath it rolling over. A shape rose under the surface, huge and slow, and the water bulged upward, glossy as a whale's back. A smell hit us, sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long on a grave. Lenora screamed through her gag. The colonel froze, then whispered, "Yes, yes, take her and leave my son." Mother Saba lifted both hands and began to chant in a language that cut through the colonel's words like a blade. The torches flickered hard, bending toward her as if listening. The shape under the water paused. The surface quivered. Mother Saba's voice rose, and with it the air shifted, not warmer but sharper, like storm wind before lightning. She shouted a final word and threw something into the sink. It was the carved figure I had seen in her cabin. It struck the black water and sank without a sound. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the sink erupted. Not in a splash, but in a sudden boil, as if the water had turned to rage. The bulging shape collapsed inward. A howl rose from beneath the surface, not animal, not human, but like a whole marsh inhaling pain. The colonel fell backward onto the mud, dragging Lenora down with him. Josiah and one of the men rushed forward and cut her bonds, pulled the gag free. She gasped like she had been underwater. The colonel scrambled up, face pale. He roared at Mother Saba. "What did you do? You ignorant old devil, you have doomed my son." Mother Saba stepped closer until she was a yard from him. She said, "Your son was doomed when you decided to buy life with death." The colonel drew a pistol from his coat, hand shaking. He aimed it at her chest. I stepped forward instinctively, but Josiah caught my sleeve. Mother Saba did not flinch. She said, "Shoot me and the mouth will open again. It will open for your boy first." The colonel hesitated. In that hesitation, the sink moved again. This time the black water rose like a hand. A tendril of muck and reeds lifted out and snaked toward the colonel's ankle. It rapped once, then yanked. He screamed and fired the pistol into the air. He fell hard, dragged toward the edge. He clawed at the mud, leaving furrows. He shrieked for help. Lenora stumbled forward, sobbing, but Josiah held her back. The other two men seized the colonel's arms, trying to pull him away. But the tendril was too strong. Another rose, then another, wrapping his legs and waist. His boots slid into the black water. He bellowed, "Reverend, help me!" I took a step, then stopped. In that second I saw every wagon Clara described, every infant grave, every bruised wrist, every silent hymn in the back pew. I heard Crowley's voice saying, "Don't become like me." Mother Saba's eyes met mine. She said softly, "Choose who you serve." The tendrils pulled. The colonel's body tipped over the edge. For a moment he hung there, half on land, half over the mouth, sputtering prayers and curses. Then the water surged up and swallowed him whole. There was no splash. There was only a long gurgle, like a throat closing, and then silence. The water flattened. The moon reflected clean on it as if nothing had happened. We stood frozen. Lenora collapsed into the mud, shaking, a broken sound ripping from her chest. Mother Saba knelt beside her, laid a hand on her back. She said, "Breathe. You are not the offering tonight." Lenora sobbed. "I saw him. I saw it take him." Mother Saba said, "You saw what he fed grow strong. Now it will starve." She turned to me. Her eyes were tired beyond age. She said, "We must go before the marsh changes its mind." We moved fast back through the reeds, torches low. At the quarters, people gathered in silent clusters, eyes huge in the firelight as Josiah told them what had happened. Some wept quietly, Others just stared west, as if waiting for the night to undo itself. Mother Saba stood in the center of them all and said, "It is done. No more children to the mouth. But this house is still a house built on bones. We must leave before the world comes asking questions." Josiah nodded. Men began to collect bundles, women waking children, the quarters turning into a whirlwind of quiet urgency. I rode to the Harrow house with Lenora at dawn. We found Robert in a fevered sleep. When Lenora touched his cheek, he sighed like a weight slid from his chest. The servants in the house moved with stiff terror, whispering about the colonel being lost in the marsh. I knew the story that would be told. Bandits, quicksand, a hunting accident, anything but the truth. By midday, a patrol from town arrived. Sheriff Mills, a heavy man with a red nose, listened to Lenora. Trembling account of the colonel riding into the marsh and never returning. He accepted it with a grave nod that felt rehearsed. When I tried to mention the sink, he fixed me with a warning stare and said, "Reverend, grief makes folks imagine devils. We will search the marsh, but you should tend to the widow and the boy." He did not search long. 2 days later, he reported the colonel's body could not be found and declared him dead by misadventure. The church held a memorial service at St. Matthew. The bishop came in black robes and praised the colonel's virtues, called him a pillar of the community. He did not look once toward the back pews. Reverend Crowley sat beside me, hands shaking, eyes down. When the hymns rose, I heard the back benches sing louder than the front, and I knew they were not singing for the colonel. After the service, the bishop pulled me aside. He said quietly, "You were close to Harrow. You will remember him kindly." I said, "I will remember the truth." His face hardened. He said, "Truth is a servant of order, young man, not a weapon for zeal. Save your zeal for the pulpit." I understood what he meant. The church would cover this up the way it had covered years of offerings. If I pushed, I would be silenced, maybe worse. Yet silence felt like tying my own hands into the same knot Crowley wore. That night I went to the quarters and found them almost empty. Fires cold, cabins stripped, only Mother Saba remained sitting on a stump, staring toward the marsh. I asked where they went. She said, "North, along the river. Some to free land if they find it, some to swamps where chains cannot follow. They left because the colonel's death will make the Harrow estate weak, and weak owners lash harder." I said, "What about you?" She smiled faintly. She said, "I am old root in this dirt. I do not travel. I stay until the last door is shut." I told her I feared the church would keep hiding this. She shrugged. She said, "Churches hide what makes men rich. Marshes keep what makes men humble. The truth will walk out when it is ready." Then she looked sharply at me. She said, "But you, Reverend, you must decide if you will be another collar man who prays while wagons pass in the night, or if you will be a man who breaks the wagon wheels." I asked what she wanted of me. She said, "Take the child." She meant Clara. My breath caught. I said, "How?" She said, "Lenora will leave now that her chain is gone. She will take her boy back to her family in Charleston. She will not take Clara unless you tell her why she should. And the bishop will not protect a slave child. You will." I found Clara that evening in the servants' corridor, sweeping with slow mechanical strokes. When I told her the colonel was dead, she dropped the broom and stared at me like she was waiting for the lie to unwrap itself. I said, "He will not hurt you again." She nodded once, not trusting joy yet. I said, "Come with Lenora and Robert to Charleston. You will be free in that house." Clara shook her head slowly. She said, "Free like you mean, or free like they say in church?" I said, "Free like you mean." She studied me a long time, then said softly, "Mother Saba say you different." I said, "I am trying to be." Tears welled in her eyes but did not fall. She said, "If I go, will Mother Saba be alone?" I had no good answer. I said, "She chose to stay, but what you survive is also her work." Clara nodded. She said, "Then I go." We left before dawn, 2 days later. Lenora looked hollow but lighter, like something had unclenched inside her. Robert, for the first time since I met him, sat up in the carriage and watched the trees with quiet curiosity instead of fear. Clara rode with them, holding a small bundle of her things and a carved bead Mother Saba had pressed into her palm the night before. At the edge of the estate, we passed Mother Saba standing in the road. She did not wave. She only lifted 2 fingers to her brow in a gesture that felt older than any salute. Clara leaned out the window and whispered, "Thank you." Mother Saba nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the quarters that would soon be burned or repurposed for some new cruelty. I returned to St. Matthew alone. Reverend Crowley died that winter. The bishop appointed a new rector who preached harder about obedience than mercy. When I tried to speak of the quarters emptied overnight, he told me to focus on my duties. I resigned within the month. I could not stand behind a pulpit that had become a curtain. I moved north, not because I thought I could change the world in one breath, but because I had learned the air down here was soaked in bargains that kept choking me. Years later, after war had come and passed, I heard a rumor that the Harrow estate had rotted into swamp, the house sinking a little more each season. People said they heard singing out there sometimes, and sometimes they heard nothing at all, the kind of silence that makes horses balk. They said an old woman lived on the rise until she died in her sleep, and the day she was buried, the reeds around the old sink withered in a perfect circle, as if something beneath the water had finally starved. I do not know if that part is true, but I know this. Evil does not always wear claws or smoke. Sometimes it wears a fine coat and a Bible and makes a church into a counting house for blood. And sometimes the only thing between that evil and the helpless is an old woman in a cabin who remembers names the powerful try to erase. If you stayed with me to the end, maybe you felt what I felt standing at the edge of that black water, the moment when a life depends not on what you believe, but on what you choose. And if you ever find yourself in a place that smells sweet and rotten at the same time, a place where people whisper a name like smoke through a crack in a door, remember that the door is real. Remember that there are guards you might not recognize until you need them. And remember that some stories are not meant to be forgotten, because forgetting is how the mouth stays fed.